Hello to all the participants. I am Floriane Morin. Claire Brison, Olivier Schintz and me are very happy to welcome you back for this second panel dedicated to creating and exhibiting reparation in action, ? Many of you are following the webinars this afternoon. Thank you so much. And a special welcome to all those who join us now. We have placed our conference under the banner of human rights and museums responsibility. Our keynote, Christine Carpenter, has defended these fundamental principles in her interview last Thursday. The video is available on Global Provenance website. The link is shared by the chat with you. Our three guests will now open up new creative perspectives to build a future of culturally sustainable initiatives and confront us with what matters most in museum practices, dealing with items or archives from every colonial context. I mean respect, dialogue, caring, and caution. It's our pleasure to introduce this panel dedicated chairwoman, Senam Okudzeto. Senam is a British-American artist and writer of Ghanaian and US descent. Her research and practice investigates previously overlooked social, political histories in the context of art, architecture, modernity, memory, and material culture, with a particular focus on West Africa and its diasporas. She is a doctoral candidate in cultural studies at Birkbeck College, University of London. She has taught at institutions in Europe, West Africa, and the USA. She is the founder of Art in Social Structures and now semi-dormant Ghanaian NGO that promotes heritage and educational initiatives in Ghana. She is one of the artists who were given carte blanche at the exotic exhibition at the Palais de Rumine in Lausanne, and she presented her film Disappearing Africans, a response to extract from Diderot and d'Alembert encyclopedia, such as Traite des nègres, conquête, état de nature, Suisse, or honor. The film's theme is the effacement of the peoples of a continent by slavery and consequently of their stories and experiences in history. Senam, the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. And also thank you to the organizers of the conference for inviting me to moderate this panel. I'm afraid to everybody in the audience that my internet connection is a little bit wobbly. So I'm going to try to make short shrift of this introduction. The framework of this panel, of this conference, has been very good at addressing the complicated history of museums, of collections, often a history that began or is inextricably tied to acts of colonial violence, of conquest. And today's panelists have produced interesting critical responses as art historians, as artists, as performers to this problematic history. And what's really great is that the existing panels that have already taken place, like the conversation between Karine Nayeli-Durand and the human rights lawyer Christine Carpenter, helped to frame some of the presentations in our discussion today. Like Christine Carpenter in her discussion on the 21st of January revealed that in America in the 1800s, there was a practice of collecting indigenous human body parts. And by the 1990s, the Smithsonian Museum had, and I quote, 18 to 19,000 human body parts in its collection. And activism legislations then needed to take place to repatriate those human body parts to indigenous communities. So this surprised me because I've always known there is a strange history of body parts in museums, but I'd never realized the grand scale of it. And there's also another panel that just prior to this one, which was Beatrice Voiro, who spoke of the Lucas Stehlen and Theo Meyer objects in the Museum del Culturen in Basel, which also in part contains objects that were robbed from graves in French Polynesia. There's a very complex history to the way in which we look at objects and artifacts, and all of our panelists show us different ways in which the body is always central to the discourse of colonialism and is often the site of colonial violence. But many of our panelists also show us how the body can be a site for the recovery from these acts of violence and for the restitution of human dignity as well as human rights. I feel like some historical context. Our panelists are all extremely accomplished, but they have concentrated their work into 5-minute videos that are very intense. So actually, each of them could give a 2-hour presentation. And I'm hoping that through the discussion, we can expand towards the larger research they've done, because they've really done an incredible amount of work. I am going to try and give a little background to help flesh out some of the things that will help you understand more. For instance, we have works that respond to the 1897 British sacking of Benin. It's a very important historic moment where the British claim to be retaliating for the murder of their envoys. Their envoys were actually going to try and ambush the Benin Kingdom, which was a very lucrative trade route, very important for trade, not just in West Africa, but for the Portuguese, for Europeans who, the Portuguese had first come into contact with the Kingdom of Benin in the late 1400s, in about 1490. And they traded slaves, ivory, artifacts, and the Benin Kingdom was said to be so rich, it was a city kingdom, that the road to enter the kingdom, a forest kingdom, enter the kingdom in the forest was said to be 1 kilometer wide, just to give a sense of its power and might. And the British in 1897 launched a second attack to try and subdue the kingdom and take over its trade routes, burning the kingdom's capital to the ground, and in doing so, looting and pillaging its most precious artifacts, its ivories and its bronze castings. These castings then found their way, and these artifacts found their way into collections all over the world, the Met, especially the British Museum, in museums in Germany. And the history of these stolen artifacts resonates within the consciousness of African art. And some of the artifacts, like the mask of the Queen Mother of Benin, the Mask of Idia, has become a major symbol of colonial theft and the refusal of institutions to do restitution. Because when in 1977, the Nigerian government tried to borrow this mask for the Festac International Arts Festival, the British Museum said, well, no, because it's climate controlled. And if we sent the mask back, it would disintegrate from the shock of the climate change. And you're not equipped to receive back this form of heritage that was stolen from you. So this image became very strongly symbolic of the violence of the theft, and then the sort of patronizing and paternalizing discourse of modernity that refused the repatriation of these artifacts. And the work of Yuri Canero and Samson Odiemen deals very directly with this legacy in a social, psychological, and actually even a spiritual way. Therefore, it's very important to bear in mind this history when looking at the performance. Also, we have, where are we? We have our third panelist, Maria Inigo Clavo, who also deals with the subject of colonial violence, trauma, and recovery. For her presentation on the artistic and cultural responses to the and the patrimoine, her work again underscores the importance of the body and how the discourse of the body remains central to understanding and recovering and resisting the traumas induced by acts of colonial violence and conquest. Similarly, the work of Ana Bilbao shows us how artistic responses to the colonial structures museums can create a new social awareness and a new psychological awareness of how these structures are subliminally perpetuated in ways that we didn't really understand. And this is a very wry and incisive analysis, but she also offers us alternatives to museum structures. And her presentation, I think, will allow you to look with new perspectives on the site of the body again as a site of colonial trauma, even in today's museum experiences. So now I'm going to just read a little bit of the biographies of our panelists before we get to the videos. Who do we have first? Anna Bilbao is a lecturer in modern and contemporary art at the University of York in the United Kingdom. Her research explores histories of exhibition making and art institutions, as well as contemporary art from the global South. Prior to joining York, she was editor of After All Journal, research fellow at the After All Research Centre at Central St Martin's University of the Arts, London, and teaching fellow at the University of Essex. In 2017, she was scholar in the art history department at KU Leuven, Belgium. Maria Ingo Clavo is a researcher, curator, and lecturer at the Open University of Catalonia with a PhD from the Universidad Complutense, Madrid. She has been associate lecturer at Central St Martin's School of Arts at Exhibition Studies program and lecturer at the University of Essex Masters in Curating Latin American Art. Her research focuses on coloniality, curating and museology, modernity and its inventions of otherness, untranslatability and art in Latin America, with special attention to Brazilian art. She has written extensively on the display of non-Western knowledges and coloniality. She edited an issue of the bilingual magazine Revisiones entitled, Is It Possible to Colonize? And is now co-editing with Claudia Hopkins a special issue of Art and Translation magazine that will be published by Routledge. Beatriz Navarro and Yuri Canero co-direct Oniricon, a physical and metaphysical theatre performing arts project with reference to the physical theatre style. They have come together with Samson Odiemen to produce Eyagbon's Mirror, a collaboration between Samson Odiemen and Oniricon. After leaving the Amsterdam Jazz Conservatory, Yuri Canero, the Swiss artist, continued to develop his percussion and voice study on the road from West Africa to Italy, passing by India and landing in Mexico, where he worked and studied ritual dance for 3 years and also somatic movement. In Marseille, he studied at the FAR and obtained the diploma in dramaturgy in public space. He's also part of the European Network in situ, and since 2015, he has been co-director of the site-specific dance theater company Oniricon. In 2018, he co-created and performed Gaia Gaudi with Gardi Hutter, Michelle Vogel, and Beatriz Navarro. And he has also been selected for the Swiss National Festival Schweizer Theatertreffen. Beatriz Navarro completed her training as a contemporary dancer at the National School of Classical and Contemporary Dance at the National Institute of Fine Arts, Mexico City. And for 20 years, Beatriz Navarro has been dancing with various national and international dance companies in Mexico, Spain, Costa Rica, and France. Samuel Odiemen's biography has just on walkies. Samuel, you have to forgive me, I'm going to read your bio before the questions properly. But Samuel is a contemporary artist based in Graz, who's very accomplished. And he is also from a line of the Guild of Traditional Craftsmen from Benin. And he's also a descendant of the royal families who were robbed during the Benin conquest. And therefore his testimony is very unique and special today, because he really brings multiple dimensions and historical perspectives to his presentation. And Samuel, you have to forgive me, I'm going to dig out your bio for the next part of this. And so now, without further ado, I look forward to seeing the video presentations of our panelists. Thank you.
The Museum of European Normality, Community Museums and Practices of Display. The longer version of this paper has 3 main arguments. The first is that the work of installation art titled The Museum of European Normality by artists Maria Teresa Alves and Jimmy Durham denaturalizes 3 distinctive aspects of display that are often taken for granted. The paper focuses on 3 works authored by Alves, amongst various others included in this installation. Her works open up the question of social justice within methods of display, teaching us that colonial violence may be contained in our very ways of exhibiting. Secondly, I argue that these works unveil how the very nature of display is often concealed behind an imagined paradigm of European normality, which risks the perpetuation of epistemic violence through the act of exhibiting. I call this risk a violence of display. Such risk is rendered visible in these three works through three specific gestures they underscore. The paper offers a detailed description of each work and further elaborates on how the work highlights those gestures. So the non-universality of the formats of exchange within the space of display is present in the work Okuleskis, an investigation of cross-cultural eye contact. The work shows how Europeans perceive people who do not look at them in the eye while having a conversation through two male characters. One man embodies the European and the other one represents the rest of the world. Although a silent exchange of gazes is on display, the subtitles make visible to the viewer both men's thoughts. Okulesics teaches us an unspoken violence arises when we assume all codes are shared. We can extrapolate this idea to the act of display in the sense that assuming a universality of formats of display and exchange is a form of epistemic violence, a violence of display. We can identify what I call extractivist attitudes of display in the work Male Display Among European Populations that features an indigenous anthropologist from Brazil who visits Europe for the purpose of investigating the custom of some European males to touch their testicles in public. The researcher speaks to the camera, indicating to the viewer that she is conducting her investigation in a typical town in Europe, and that an informant has agreed to reveal some of the secrets surrounding this ritual. The video shows the white male as an object of study and the indigenous female as the one with the knowledge to investigate and the power to interpret what the informant is sharing. Towards the end of the video, the scholar spontaneously raises her eyebrows in response to the information shared by the informant. Through a caricaturized version of the roles, the work invites us to reflect into how information for display is originally extracted, framed, and presented as the informant's knowledge appears to live outside the framework of what is considered worth learning, but not worthless enough for us to think that we don't have the right to observe it as spectators. Finally, a disparity in power relations within display becomes apparent in Fair Trade Head, a participatory photo series that invites Europeans to participate in a head exchange program. The invitation is Alves's answer to a restitution controversy in 2007 at the Rouen Museum, where in response to petitions by the Maoris and the government of New Zealand, the museum started the process to return a tattooed Maori head from their collection. The artist's invitation prompts reflection on both the ethics of display and the spectator's role in the exhibition space. Who has the right to display what? How is this right acquired? Who has the right to see what's displayed? And how is this right acquired? Are some questions that signal towards such disparity in power relations within display. Finally, I argue that display can also be a powerful means of fostering social justice. There are instances in which display practices can safeguard communities from physical and epistemic violence, as has been the case with community museums across Latin America and the Caribbean. The Roundtable of Santiago in Chile, which took place in 1972, was key to the emergence and proliferation of these spaces in the region. Many community museums emerged after local inhabitants found archaeological artifacts they sought to safeguard and maintain access to, not wanting to see their heritage behind glass in faraway cities and in places where they would normally visit. Heritage is not only a strong component of the often indigenous communities' histories and their sense of identity, but it can reinforce their connection to their land and territory. In some cases, these museums have aided groups of people in asserting their land rights, making such spaces crucial devices to protect people from abuse and dispossession. Although difficult to establish a precise definition of community museums, some shared aims of these spaces include the safeguarding of material and immaterial heritage through self-governance, the development of collective processes of self-interpretation, including developing research methods and display strategies from within the community, the importance not only of community participation, but also the inhabitants' capacity for decision-making, accompanied by community consultation. The strengthening of identities by means of enhancing creativity and articulating local modes of expression, and the opportunity to create bridges of exchange with other communities. Community museums emerge from and for the community in which they are located. To sum up, on the one hand, display can imply the kind of violence thematized in the three works from the Museum of European Normality. On the other hand, display can play a positive role in identity formation and land rights via the work of community museums in Latin America. Such a conceptual dichotomy invites further considerations directed specifically towards display, seen as a more than a mere act of craftsmanship. Forms, processes, and responses to display are arguably as significant or more so than mere spatial configurations, insofar as, for better or for worse, they articulate discourse from within or on behalf of a given community. As a colonial or as a decolonial gesture, display is able to institute patterns of behavior, thus partaking in processes of subjectivation. Consequently, I argue that any attempt at decolonizing museums should also give serious consideration to the very mechanism of exhibiting. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I would like to introduce my research, juxtaposing or creating dialogue between different images that take part in my research that is related to political agency of indigenous women, textile, labor, contemporary art, but also management of heritage and reparations. So first image is this one that was took in the trial of Sepulsarco in 2016. It was the first time that the case of sexual slavery during the war is considered as a category of war crime in the history of law. That's why it was so important, and explain, I mean, the situation that happened to these women that appear in the image in the 80s during the civil war in Guatemala that happened from the 60s to 96. That was the end of the conflict. We can see in this picture that they decide to hide their identity using these clothes. That is some traditional clothes called perraje that is used for different purposes, as for example, wearing babies or wrapping things, wrapping food, or wearing food as well. And in this jest, I think they were a part of protecting themselves, their identity, what gives a sense of their own feeling of the situation. I think it's interesting how the idea of fear is in constant feedback with the idea of shame or the sense of shame when we are speaking about traumatic experiences. The second image is this picture of Andrea Monroe that is an artwork she did in that year, listening the recordings of the trial, listening the testimonies of these women, in which she juxtaposed the picturesque and idealized image of women, of folklorism, with some images of the trial that she did by hand. By doing so, Monroe is claiming about an image of indigenous women that is not based on the past or in a temporal sense, but is based on their political reality and contemporary situation. Third element would be for me this museum or any museum, but especially this one that is in the city of Guatemala, that is the Museo del Traje, the Museum of the Dress of the indigenous people. Which one is the role in these processes of resignification of the experiences of the bodies of the indigenous population, and which one is the role in this struggle for the rights and for overcoming the coloniality of society, of Western society. It's interesting because the museum has a room specialized in these clothes that these women are wearing, the perraje, and they are speaking about what the purpose, I mean, what it's used for, or they have some pieces from 19th century or beginning of 20th century. is working especially in the preservation of techniques and also of pieces of clothes, of historical clothes of different regions. So it's not involved in questions of, again, mourning or resignification of identities or overcoming the devaluation of the everyday life of these women in the society. And the dress is a battlefield, so that's why it's so important, because it's a point of tension where different forces are coexisting. As for example, there is a kind of pressure of demand of the society for these women to not wear the dress because it's like a symptom of oppression, of chauvinism, or also of backward or regionalism, for example. But at the same time, touristic agencies are demanding these women to wear the dress because of the tourists and not mixing them with other clothes for not confusing them, or also are asking the labor of doing textile to be cheap for the tourists, for them to have a good experience. And also as well, this is very important, it's women that use the dress, the regional dress, is also showing a self-determination of a resistance of not being devaluated by the Western society within Western. And as preserving the culture with the dress could be easily turned into a passive content. So one of the Mayan feminist role is to request for a change in this passive role and to ask also for an active acknowledgement of this resistance act. So women as political agents as well in this political struggle, when they are, especially when they are wearing the dress, defending the culture and so on. And I would say the fourth element would be the last, in the last years with the revalorization of indigenous culture, some industries, of fashion industries, has looked at this production of knowledge that is an ancestral knowledge that has been passed through generation of creating textiles. And in 2017, the national movement of weavers, that are women, they asked to the parliament to change the law, and they got success in this, asking them to acknowledge that the textile were not an individual property, as some companies, some fashion companies wanted to do. This knowledge, this intellectual property was collective. So it was the first time that is another idea of intellectual property is not Western and modern, but has another sense and another understanding that has to do with the heritage of the whole community. And in the same way, in the last years, also women are asking, making pressure for demanding being the administrators of their own patrimony. So not being like passive objects to be regulated by the government and the state, but being active agents in this manage of the heritage. For example, some pieces that are sewn in museums are sacred, so they should be not visible, or different images, for example, tourist agencies are promoting, they are reproducing colonial preconceptions and racism. So the idea is of the research is also to question the idea of how repatriation of objects to museums, to national museums in Latin America, for example, is really has to do with reparation, because the national and the colonial is very often linked, and they are reproducing the same strategies and the same neutralizations of the political agency of indigenous community in this case. So thank you very much, and I hope we can debate and we can speak more during the debate. Thanks.
I am Samson Ogiamien. I'm a visual artist. I love creating sculptures and making them become alive through performance. Through my family line, I belong to the mythical dynasty of the Ogiamiens, as well as the Guild of Royal Bronze Casters of Benin Kingdom in Nigeria.
I am Beatriz Navarro, artistic co-director of Oniricon. I am contemporary dancer and choreographer.
Hello, I'm Yuri Kainero. I co-direct Oniricon. I'm a musician and a theater maker.
We are working on an artistic project titled Cadre. And it's a project that has to do with restitution.
I am Chief Kingsley Osai, inner of the custodian of the broadcasters in Kingdom, Musée.
So the project, we basically had the idea to create this Iagbon mask, and then to create it here in Benin City with your guild, and then bring it to Europe and propose to Ethnographic Museum to expose this work. And then with my theater company, Oniricon, go to the museum and steal this work. Of course, is a stealing that is a fiction. The museums are aware of it. There are so many ritual objects that has been stolen and that have been transformed into a museum object. And so we are trying to do the opposite way. We're making an artwork, a museum object, and we're going to steal it to make a ritual. And when I say a ritual, I mean to invent ourselves an artistic ritual to do with this object. If you wish, I would just like to know what you think about it when I tell you our intention.
Great. I think the laudable idea. And all the reasoning behind what you have just said, I think fits. It's a reversal of history. Let me put it in a more broader manner. More like a reversal of history, spiritually and otherwise. It was a good thing you came down here to cast it here. The spiritual involvement in it too actually is taking place here too. So it's more like giving life to the ones they think they have in their museums that they think are dormant. It's a reawakening of what they assume to be dormant. To me, it's a welcome development.
The casting of the bronze mask entitled Iagbon took place in Benin City in order to cooperate with the Benin Royal Bronze Casters. It allowed the director of the company Oniricon to experience our culture and this traditional casting process on site, discussing the topic of restitution and asking for opinions and suggestions to the chief of the guild casters about our project and other intellectual and spiritual authorities. Collaboration with museums and Africans in diaspora will be a great opportunity to sensitize the public concerning the problems related to African cultural heritage in European museums.
Working site-specific allow us to adapt the performance to the characteristic of each location, and when possible, to integrate local artists that already have a relation to the subject of the project. In all of Oniricon works, the movement of the audience is dramaturgically very important. The use of the real landscape as a scenography allow us to carry the audience to a mythical space-time. Like in a ritual, they find themselves physically inside the act. Reality and imagination can merge.
The scenic movement is nourished by the imaginary that detonates the somatic research, and it's linked with the notion of ritual that inhabits Western and not Western cultures. It is an artist's bet between the direct experience of the corporal microcosm and the narrative construction of the cultural macrocosm.
Wawesin wanagui maro, biyeno maogedo, yeno baudi, noke Europire, enakio. Ogwena, begogeha. Enes oke guru lai, agba uzale, yadwe, iwino namu, we agba uzale natie, Geneva, the Switzerland.
Thank you. So that was our last video, am I correct? And now I'd like to pose some questions to the panelists. How's my connection? Are we okay? Someone give me a thumbs up. Excellent. So I'll start with Anna Bilbao. Anna, I was immediately struck by the terminology, the violence of display in your presentation. And it really got me thinking, not only through the examples of the artistic project you discuss, but also through the sense that even as an artist, as somebody who belongs to the initiated museum goer, I've often felt in certain circumstances a sense of violence through the architectural experience of being in museums. Sometimes because I worked teaching in New York after school programs for children whose parents had to work and therefore couldn't come home at the end of the day. And part of my job was to sort of try and bring these children into the art world and introduce them to museum going practices. And I always felt when we went to museums like maybe the Met, which were at the time meant to be free, there was this very aggressive demand for money when you entered. So you were demanded to give donations. And I felt that this was not a way to encourage people to share in common heritage because you were demanded money before you could even get in. And if you were a young kid just learning to enter museum spaces, it's really turning you off. And I wondered if, you know, decolonizing the museum might be asking for donations at the end when you leave, rather than when you appear. But this isn't the main response, because in your talk, you start to talk about community museums and how community museums have in Latin America managed to develop alternative strategies for creating inclusion, but also even creating a sense of ownership of land, of space, of places that communities were in danger of losing. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about the part of your study on community museums in Latin America.
Yeah, thank you, Senam, very much, and thanks also for sharing your own experience when visiting museums in the past. So I think there is a lot of existing scholarship in relation to community museums, that they are not only in Latin America. I think that they stem from, well, first of all, from a 1971 resolution that was taken after the 10th General Assembly of ICOM in Grenoble, that it signaled, or it sort of spoke to the fact that the very traditional concept of the museum was on the verge of elapsing, especially this concept of the museum as a space dedicated to preserve nature and culture or heritage through the accumulation of objects. In that conference, there were speakers and participants from Africa and Latin America that also expressed how they felt that also this traditional concept of the museum was not necessarily suited in relation to cultural specificity of non-European continents and people, and their need to develop so-called independent museum models. So such concerns surfaced given that European museum models were imported, to put it lightly, and didn't necessarily address local needs. So in response to that, the Roundtable of Santiago was organized the next year in 1972. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Roundtable of Santiago, but it was a discussion, for those of you who are not, it was a discussion that took place in the form of an interdisciplinary workshop, and specialists or people from many different areas working in museums, not only art, were participating. And during the event, one of the most striking aspects of the event is that members of museums realized that they were doing actually very little to address unprivileged members of their own communities. And then there were various discussions that were very informed also by the concept of the eco-museum. That was a notion that was at the time being created in France, more particularly by Hugh de Varenne, that was at the time the ICOM director, and Georges-Henri Rivière, I'm so sorry for my pronunciation, that was the previous director of ICOM. But the notion of the integral museum was generated from this conference in Latin America as well. And this notion is that the museum should be an educational space that we at the service of the community, but at the same time considering its cultural, natural, and social environments. So after the Roundtable of Santiago, there was a proliferation of community museums in Latin America and in Europe, but there are also community museums in Africa. And today there are like many conferences and accounts of a lot of community museums emerging in countries like China, Japan, Taiwan, and in many different African countries as well. There is today a network based in Mexico called Red de Museos Comunitarios en América, and they have created a network that connects these different museums in the region, and they have created structures for mutual support and knowledge exchange while respecting their own local conditions.
That's brilliant. I mean, as you were talking, it suddenly makes me realize, you know, that when I lived in New York for 8 years, and the community museums then were the Studio Museum in Harlem, servicing the African-American community, and the El Museo del Barrio, which was African-American and Puerto Rican. But that particular community of El Museo del Barrio, if we were just to talk of the Puerto Ricans in New York, it's 1 million people. But they also serve, they provide access to Latin American heritage in general. So it's hundreds of millions of people. So I think this sense of like how big the community is, a community can be very large. Mm-hmm. But I read your paper on this project, and I noticed that there were examples of actions happening at community museums that seem pretty radical, and the kind of things that contemporary museums would love to do now. I don't know if you'd give some quick examples of the kind of community activities or cultural activities that some of the museums you've written about engaged in.
Yeah, I think that there loads and loads of different examples because they're at least in many different countries. So it's difficult to be precise here. But for example, I'm going to talk about maybe in general terms rather than specific terms. But I think processes, one important aspect of community museums is that it needs to emerge from the community. Teresa Morales Lerch and Cuauhtémoc Camarena have theorized a lot about this and have been trying to work on the definition of what is a community museum, especially in its difference with an eco museum. And one of the, or some of the most important criteria is that although partnerships and collaborations with external stakeholders like academic advisors or public and private institutions, local associations and authorities are very important, it is the community that needs to hold the decision-making capacity in community museums. And that display decisions must be taken from within. Something that I want to talk about, but maybe we can talk about this with others as well, and is what you pointed out, Senam, is the notion of community that I think we're using, or maybe I have been losing the word like really lightly, but I think we can never assume that a community is an homogeneous group of people. I think within our different engagements in the city or in our countries or with our families, we can belong simultaneously to different communities and not to others. So I think that it's important not to reduce or not to assume that communities are necessarily homogeneous groups of people. And yeah, I think that in terms of specific examples, let me think about, okay. It's the Italulu Museum of San Martin Jamuelupan in Tlaxiaco in Oaxaca, in Mexico. And they decided to exhibit their archaeological artifacts, but also to focus on traditional medicine. That was something that was important for them. And members of the community carried out interviews with traditional healers, and the exhibition display, among other things, offers advice and techniques on how to appease the offended land by making offerings and saying special prayers for the land.
What year was this?
I think it's a permanent display, but I need to check the year in which the museum was inaugurated.
We can return to this as well.
Okay.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm going to move on because I think your work and your project ties into Maria Inigo Clavo's research and presentation. I think I'm going to keep returning to your notion of the violence of display because it seems to so appropriately describe some of the colonial acts of violence on the body that are subliminal in a way. So for instance, Maria, are you there? Looking her work on the Reparaje, looking at the images of the trial are very moving. And then to go from those images of the trial to the fashion shoot, which is so shocking, which itself is a kind of neo-colonial imposition to use human beings as a backdrop for this superficial fashion that means nothing. And the fact is that for me, the reason that image is so shocking is it's something that has happened repeatedly since my childhood. Sort of a fashion model flying off somewhere where there's a minority community and contrasting their body with, you know, the high fashion with the body of economically less privileged locals, and that being a kind of recolonization of the culture and an imposition. And I feel like I almost wish there was some sort of legislation against doing that. Like people should not be allowed to let this happen because it happened in the 70s, it happened in the 80s, it happened in the 90s. I don't know when Maria's image is from, but it continues to happen. And it looks more recent. And this idea that, that like women's bodies are constantly under assault, even passively, even by other women or by the industries. And this commodification of the textiles and the bodies, and the fact that the industrial industry would even try to put copyright on these traditional textiles. And then that feminists would have to struggle to reclaim the textile and reclaim their heritage as not belonging to a primitivist trope, which is absurd. So I'm going to switch over to Maria because I think Maria maybe will have some questions for you directly. Maria, are you there? Maria?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, great. Hi. So thank you for your very dense and rich, presentation. And I also wanted to return to the trial, and I wanted to ask you about the impact of this trial, because the Guatemalan Civil War, it's almost 40 years, it's 4 decades of incredible human injustice. When we talk about colonialism, you did not mention the heavy involvement of the CIA in the Guatemalan Civil War and the huge amount of documentation, work by lawyers, human rights lawyers like Jennifer K. Harbury on this. So they also, I think, belong to the expression of the neo-colonial in the history of Guatemala. And I wondered, given this long history, how the trial and this image of the trial, which, given that so many artists responded to it, I wondered if you could expand on its significance and the artistic responses in particular to the use of the paraje and its symbolism as a site of protection and resistance.
Okay, thanks a lot for your comments and for all the comments during the process of getting here. I have to say that in the original paper, I mentioned quite a lot of artists that work on textiles, and not all of them are responding to the trial itself. But it's rather this Andrea Monroe that is the one that I have present here, and also I will share with you the screen. Can you see it? Yes. This is the case of Regina Galindo that did some. This was the most direct expression of reaction. What she asked some women, some artisans, to do this 10 meters perraje by hand for this performance. That was something intimate. It's true that it was not something public, but was done in a church in Italy, and she presented herself as kind of. I think what is interesting is that she presented herself in a way as a virgin, with using the perraje that was something to protect the women, but at the same time hiding within the perraje. So again, this idea of shame, fear, that for me is was very present in the idea of the trauma. Yeah, so is there also because these women, I mean, when these women in the communities, when they are called grandmothers, they have like a place of respect in the community, like a place of authority in a way. But these women, after these traumatic events, they were marginalized in their communities. So they recovered the status of grandmothers when they, after the trial, where it was acknowledged that it was an act of injustice through them during the war. So that's why it was that much impact, because they also had to live social death within their own community. And I would say that a part of before speaking more about other artists, you are right about the Civil War. It was a war against communism, but I think it's very important also to realize that for me was an impact that the trial, I mean, all the conflict that happened in Sepulsarco in this area was because the indigenous people were starting to look at the property of the land. So as a consequence of doing this, military detachment were to the land, and they disarticulated the community, killing men, and women had to go to escape to the mountains for years. Well, so I think it's very important that to be aware that the land and the property of land is very present. And what they wanted to do with the land is to do oil palm. That is the oil that we use for Coca-Cola or for snacks. So I think it's very linked to us, no? So I don't want to go too far but other example that I put in the video is this Marilyn Monroe, that is an artist that is working quite a lot with the clothes and the dress of her grandmother. And what she did is to look, I mean, she had to reconnect with the idea of being indigenous when she was an adult, because their parents didn't allow her to learn the language and so on. So she always worked with this idea of the pedagogy of learning about every element. So she print her grandmother dress in a kind of paper. So it was some elements that appear, other that didn't appear. So it has to do with this idea of being or not being visible, or being or not being present in that is her own history as an indigenous woman. So I don't want to go too far because there is other people to speak. So
thank you for that, though. That's it's great to learn more about the context of this work. Did you have anything you wanted to say to a question you wanted to pose to Anna?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. Thanks so much. I really would like to know your paper, the long one. to know about these museums, and it's made me think, or remember that some of the museums that were created in Brazil for the first time, like indigenous museums, were created because the government started to acknowledge rights to indigenous people. So they wanted to certificate that there it was a community, because it was kind of some studies that they called to anthropologists to certificate that some communities were indigenous or not was something absurd. And the museum had the role to explain, to certificate that it was a community, an indigenous community there, what is quite ironic. So I was wondering, because I'm also now researching about this a little bit, because the notion of identity that is under the construction of a museum, for me, is also problematic when we are speaking sometimes about culture that are not static. So it's the Western way of thinking about through fixations, like definitions. You said precisely that sometimes there are different communities that are involved in different museums. So it's not just you are not just in one museum. So I was wondering if how do you think is being solved, this idea of identity, or it has been developed more ahead or more complex way, or?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good question. I think before, yeah, and I think that the example that you gave us about the Brazilian case, I think it's a quite a common example across the region. There is this museum, El Museo de Mulaló, in Colombia, and it's precisely about Afro-Colombians being recognized in the country as members of the community, as Colombians, worth studying and identities worth highlighting. And I think that before issues of identity that I think are very important and important tools in a way to defend sometimes themselves from abuse or dispossession, I think it's also a matter of self-determination and of being able to have this capacity for decision making in terms of what the stories that we want to tell about ourselves. And it's not only the kind of story that we want to tell about ourselves, but how we articulate this narrative, and this narrative that must come from within. And I think when in this process of articulating this narrative from within, there might be, in a way, a multiplicity of identities actually forming, because I guess that's also another aspect for the Mulaló Museum. It was that they initially, the main narrative, the discursive narrative, was about Simón Bolívar. But they themselves had a discursive shift, and they say, well, why don't we talk about the things that matter to us, or about ourselves, and about the things that we do, the food that we eat, our tradition. So there was this shift from a very general sense of, I don't know, Latin American identity attached to the image of the liberator, of Bolívar, to being able to produce or articulate identities from very specific positions. But I think we can even reduce them to personal narratives and to personal stories that might not even be shared with other members within the same community. And that's why they put an emphasis on personal stories, not only community stories or oral histories, but they put a good emphasis in sharing personal accounts. But yeah, thanks very much. I'm not sure if that was a very good answer, but that was a very good question.
I thought it was a great answer. And I'm sorry to move on, because I think we're going to return to you again, time and time again in this conversation. I would like to talk about Iagbon's mirror and pose some questions to Yuri and Samson, because their work for me ties into some of the parts of both of your presentations, in that there's always a spiritual element in restitution. And when you were talking about the community museums and the spiritual act of reparation, this is absolutely fascinating, because it's something that isn't dominant in the discourse, but should be. And I remember the chief in Benin was talking about the act of performance allowing people in Europe to know that those museums are, that those artifacts are merely dormant and they'll come back to life. But first of all, I did Samson a disjustice by losing his biography. So I'm gonna just read it. Samson Ogiamin was born in Nigeria, and he's been working as a freelance artist in Graz, Austria for several years. After his training focusing on art and design, as well as welding and construction, he managed a sculptor's workshop in Nigeria. And he came to Austria in 2004, where as a young artist, he attended the 2 years master's class in sculpture at the Ortweinschule Graz, from which he graduated with a distinction in summer 2007. In 2014, he received the award of the city of Graz, promoting outstanding arts. After performing at the International Festival for Street and Puppet Theatre La Strada, he was invited to participate in the Colombo Art Biennale in Sri Lanka. And his works are based on the traditions of his home country, and it's important to him that people less familiar with art should also be able to understand his works. Samson Ogiamin sees his art as a bridge between cultures, as an opportunity for bringing people together. So with that in mind, I'd like to move to Samson and Yuri and ask you a couple of questions, which is, I'm gonna maybe throw them all out there and have you both respond in time. Samson, I would really like to ask you more about your family background as a descendant of those robbed during the Benin expedition and a member of the Bronze Casting Guild, because the tradition of bronze casting has never been lost in Benin. It's ongoing, it carries on. It's been unbroken since, I believe, the 1300s. So I'd like to know, with that in mind, what is the perception at home and what is the public memory of the loss of these bronzes, which sit so strongly, I think, within the cultural memory of those of us who are interested in restitution. And then segueing onto that, Yuri, I wanted to ask you about, to begin to discuss a bit in the construction of the work, the spiritual element and the spiritual element of restitution, because it seems something that you as a Swiss person are as equally invested in as your Nigerian participants. And I'd like to ask you, no one has talked about economic reparations, but you have talked about spiritual reparations. So what is your hope for the outcome of this? You know, how do spiritual reparations take place? How do you heal spiritual wounds? And are there outcomes that we should consider that we're not really thinking about because we think legislatively or curatorially, but like, you know, is there a new way of thinking that your performance should bring about? So maybe we'll start with Samuel. If you could tell it, Samson, if you could tell us a bit more about your background and the cultural context for this work. Thank you. Samson, are you there? Are you muted?
Samson, I think you need to unmute up on the right on the screen. You can unmute.
I have done that. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Okay. So many thanks to the organizers and of this great event. I am happy that I'm part of it, and thank you so much as well as Senam. I am a descendant of the first dynasty. Up until 12th century, the Kingdom of Benin consisted of coalition of autonomous village of communities. And then it was called Igodomigodo. And until 12th century, Benin Kingdom has been under the leadership of the Ogiamies. Then in 12th century, a prince, Oromiyan, came from the Yoruba kingdom of Ile-Ife. And he was first of all resisted by the Ogiamians because he wanted to establish the Oba Kingdom in Benin. But the Ogiamians resisted him and saying that we don't have Oba in Benin. What we have is Ogiso. And then, but however, before he went back to Ile-Ife and he renamed the Benin Ile-Ibinu, which means a land of vexation, because they didn't allow him first to establish his Oba's kingdom. However, before he left Benin for Ife, he impregnated a lady called Erimide, which gave birth to Eweka I. But however, Eweka I tried to establish the second dynasty, which, just to cut long story short, Ogiame and Eweka, they later made a treaty. Ogiame has its own domain, and as we speak, Ogiame Palace is still the only surviving pre-colonial palace complex in Benin City, in the center of Benin City, as we speak today. So finally, Eweka established the Oba's kingdom in Benin City. But as I was, growing up, I was told about those stories. And of course, as a descendant from the first dynasty, and as well as the guilds of the royal bronze casters, that also gave me the opportunity to always combine a tradition and contemporary art.
So these stories are discussed, and children are told, are told about this history and about this loss. So there's a strong public consciousness about it to this day.
Yeah. But then the tradition is still very well unique, and we still do the broadcasting. But the point is the artifacts that were stolen. This is our own archive. As you know, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So as you know, we don't have these written scripts, or we never developed the written script. So what we have is our artifacts, and this is how we tell our stories. Even when I was growing up, and my relatives and my mom, and they told me about our artifacts. So in the European Museum today, it is just more than a historical object. It is, you can see it this way, that it is the people's soul. And
because you're saying, sorry to interrupt, it's like each artifact is like a mnemonic device. It carries, it marks a point in history, it marks a lineage, it marks a story, it marks a person. And actually, yes, it remarks, those bronzes, they mark events. So you're saying a library has been stolen, not just a spiritual library.
No, exactly, exactly. And during our project in Benin City, Yuri and I, we went on the street and to ask people about their opinion on the stolen artifacts. I can tell you that everyone we ask, each and every one are saying, we need our artifacts back. We want them back home, because this is a kind of a connecting link to their ancestors, to our ancestors. And this is why And it is so unique.
Thank you. I'm going to flip this over to Yuri now to continue the response, because Yuri, what can you add to inform us on this project and the sense of what you hope to achieve with the performance? I think you're muted as well, I see. Yuri, you're muted.
And now can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So the question, what we hope to achieve? Well, I think the main achievement we can hope for is to bring some consciousness about this topic, and to create a poetical act that can be symbolically important. I think this issue is very large and needs to be addressed politically, economically, philosophically, and as an artist and directing an artistic company, I can only deal with part of it, and institutions and governments and leaders have to do a lot. But on our side, on the artist domain, what we can do, I think, is really to create a dialogue and to show also this aspect, this story on a sensible level. It is also interesting to. I'm very grateful to work with Samson, because we have very different backgrounds. I mean, I'm from Switzerland, he's from Nigeria, so he's from the community who actually create these works, and I'm not. So if Samson would do this work by itself, it would have a different meaning. But since we are doing it together, it's also arising a lot of questions for myself and for the rest of the troupe, who's in a large part European.
Oh, and can I interrupt quickly, because
yep,
part of the project, you have the intention that it will be performed at ethnographic museums in particular.
Exactly, yes, yes.
So that's
basically the project, if maybe I make it a short synthesis of it, is Samson created this mask with the Royal Bronze Caster Guild in Benin City. And we brought it now to Europe, and we are asking Ethnographic Museum to expose it inside on their exposition next to the other objects that have different provenance. And then with the theater company, we're going to steal it. And and we steal it to take it on the public space and perform a ritual with it. So it's like, as I said in the video, it's like a reversal of history. Many ritual objects have been transformed into a museum object, and we take a museum object and we make it into a ritual object. But then the question is, what kind of ritual would make sense for us, that we are a multi-nation, we are from different, you are a globalized contemporary troupe, like Samson is from Nigeria, but I'm from Switzerland, the choreographer is from Mexico. And also the question for me is, what is the role of ritual, and what kind of relation can we have with objects, with masks, that is not only the exposition in our museum room. Like as a theater maker, and that's also how I met Samson, I have been interested since a long time in animist rituals, and I'm lucky to have witnessed and participate to some in Benin, in Mexico, and in Sri Lanka, and I've been always fascinated by the power and the beauty of those rituals. And so when I see this museum in Europe, I have the feeling that not only these objects are dormant, as the chief said, and they are the memory of the colonization, but also that guarding all the proportion and difference, we have colonized ourselves also as European, and
And that's why I find interesting from my personal point of view to work on this theme and to work on this artistic project.
Thank you. So now, Samson and Yuri, thank you so much for those answers. And I think I want to let the audience know that we have our last 12 minutes of the conversation. Please, if you have any questions from the public, now is the time to raise them. But in the meantime, Yuri and Samson, do you have any questions for your colleagues on the panel?
Yeah, I have a question for Anna and Maria. I found it very interesting. Thanks for your presentations. And I was wondering what would be for you the antidote to the folklorization as a danger that could happen in this community museum? Like what are the elements that could protect this museum to be addressed to tourism instead of on the service of a community or a larger community?
Who wants to go first? Maria?
I will be very quickly. So I would say present time, like introducing every element into the present time and not allowing this non-time of folklore, of icons to have the space or to.
Yeah, thank you. Anna?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because a lot of these museums also have served as spaces for tourism to be able to become familiar, I don't know, with textile or with certain local products created by the community. So I think the tourism line is very, I think it's just a very good question. And what I would say is that as long as the members of the museum, of the people who created the museum, keep independence in terms of decision making of what is exhibited and how it's exhibited, I think that might, that might be one tiny element to try to keep as much independence in terms of self-understanding and self-determination. But I think the line is quite blurred, because a lot of these spaces rely on tourism even to survive. So there is always that danger, and I really don't have the answer. I think I wonder what do you think, Samson, about issues like this? For example, with the guild that you guys, with the man from the guild that appears in your video, what would he think about something like this?
Come again, please.
Yeah, like drawing a bit on Yuri's question, what would, there is someone who appears in your video that it's in charge, I think, of the guild of the bronze. I'm not sure.
Yeah, he's the chief guild of the Royal Bronze Casters, you know, and of course he has also been dwelling in this topic, and I think in 2007, and he was invited to Vienna, and that is how we, to discuss the repatriation of the Benin artifacts. And so he is very, very much in it. And like I said, and he still said that this is like part of his own soul. You get it? That part of his soul is being taken from him. So, and he's still dwelling on this topic.
If I can just add about the issue of folklorization and tourism is maybe not so present in Benin City, for what I could see, because there is not really so much tourism happening. I mean, there is an interest on the bronze casting, that's for sure, and there is a demand of works, but the context is maybe a little bit different.
We have two questions from the audience. I'm going to say them both, so hopefully they get answered. Ariane Nicolier asks, how do you define what healing is? Is it a symbolic idea or is it attached to actions? I'll throw that out there. And Sam Melzer asks Yuri and Samson, have Yuri and Samson approached European ethnology museums? And if so, what has been your reaction? Thanks. So maybe that's an easy one to answer quickly. And then we go to defining healing, which I think everyone can answer.
Yeah, so concerning the last question, I heard that just recently, last year, and the British Museum, some Nigerians approached the British Museum on the repatriation of the Benin artifacts. And it was said that they don't restitute, but they are committed to lending, including to Nigeria. So for me, that sounds like a colonial museum. But on the other hand, I'm happy the way the Swiss Museum, Ethnographic Museum, are very sensitive in this topic. And from the discussion yesterday, I heard that from Michaela, and she said she is open to discussion, and they are willing to, even participate in the new museum plan in Benin City. So for me, that's a welcoming development.
And if I would add just about our project, I'm not talking about the physical restitution, but just about our artistic project. We contacted about 15 museums, and we had most of them with positive answer and interest in the project. Some didn't answer at all, but there are people, fortunately, in the museums who are really willing to question their self and their past. So we are at this moment, we are negotiating with different museums in order to be able to perform this work in the museum, in the Ethnographic Museum. That's also why we have been invited to this webinar.
Okay, thank you. Anna, Maria, Samson, and Yuri, you have each 1 minute. I'm so sorry, it's a little, to try and answer the last question, which is, what are your comments on what is healing to you in the context of your presentation today? Anna and Maria, maybe you could go first if you have an answer.
Mine is a bit long, so I would give my minute to Anna.
Oh, start.
Just because I'm very interested in the missing contours of different epistemologies. I just would say that it was very interesting for me to see that healing for these women, these grandmothers, were not like something private as we have in a psychotherapy, but it was something collective, like being part of the community or providing the community with land, providing the community with a healthcare service. And so this was for them the sense of healing. So I think it's interesting to challenge a little bit our understanding of healing.
Thank you. And that was less than a minute. Thank you. Anna?
I think there are various ways and formats of healing or ways to initiate the process of healing, because I guess it's a process, not just an immediate answer. But I guess one way is recognition and legal recognition. For example, in the example that Maria was giving earlier, or in the example of the Afro-Colombian Community Museum of Mulalo, it was giving visibility to something so it could have a legal recognition that protected certain communities and their heritage from abuse and dispossession. So I think that would be that discursive element of giving visibility to something. It's a good step, if not an answer or a final at the end of the process.
But I would also say, for me as an artist, in your presentation and in all of the presentations, the sense that artistic responses were there, and the responses that you showed, which were ironic, performative, satirical, that humor could be brought. In Maria's, this sort of profound reflection on the history, that healing, for me, the artistic responses were a part of the healing process, although they're not legal or administrative, but they give an emotional analysis of the historical trauma that sometimes might elude people in more rational analyses. But I'm stealing somebody's minute. Yuri and Samson.
Shall I go?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think we're talking about a lot about in these times about reparation. And I think when we are dealing with something so huge as the colonial violence, before being able to approach reparation, there is consciousness and truth, and just as my colleagues said, just making it visible, and mourning, I would say also, that needs to be experienced before actually being able of talking of reparation. And so I don't think, I mean, healing is a big word, but I think through an artistic intervention, we can create some space in the imagination and in the emotion, as you said, Senam. I think this emotion process, it's very important. And if we can do a little help to that, I mean, I think that's our intention.
Yeah, because it's sort of like the trauma was there, and maybe part of the scars of these experiences was the trauma was never shared. And so if you don't respect the historic trauma of figures, that in itself is a repeated violation. And maybe the actual event will never be healed, but the years of understanding following the traumatic event can be healed by giving more respect to the damage done to people who suffered under these events. And maybe it's bringing dignity to the memory of historic trauma. Samson, can you give us a minute's response, please?
To me, we can't change the past, but certainly we can change the way of approach in this present time. So that is a sort of a healing to me, and even the way we're discussing it right now, you know, and this is what should be done. But of course, more should be done, and I'm so grateful that art has also a kind of strength to provoke such a discussion, so that we can change things for now.
Thank you. This conversation has been so short, and I feel it could go on much longer, and I wish that we could have given you all an hour each to speak. But at this point, I just want to say thank you to you, Yuri, Samson, Maria, Anna, and and thank you for your questions, Ariane, and the other gentleman who asked a question. I'm going to give the floor back to Florian Moran for the last few minutes and close out this session. But thank you again for your contributions. I learned an awful lot today, and I think the audience did too. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, Maria, Samson, Yuri, and you, Senam, for taking part in this very strong and passionate panel discussion. I'm sure we will continue in other formats somewhere else, but it's not over. We give you all a rendezvous next Tuesday, February the 2nd, for the 2 last webinars exploring further the legitimacy and relevance of the relations established or expected between museums and anthropological or ethnographic collections and the cultural honors of this heritage. Then we will discuss the circumstances of heritage restitution and its repercussion. So I hope to see you all next week on Tuesday. And again, thank you so much. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye. Bye, everybody.